Smoke curled from the twisted remains of the human spacecraft, the acrid scent of burning metal filling the humid air. Jake Cormack groaned as he pushed debris off his chest, his muscles protesting with each movement. His dark hair clung to his sweat-covered forehead, and he wiped his blue eyes with the back of his hand. The jungle surrounding him seemed alive, with every shadow concealing unknown threats. "Well, this is just perfect," Jake muttered, pulling himself free from the wreckage. His survival instincts kicked in as he surveyed the dense alien landscape. The tall trees, draped with thick vines and foliage, seemed to breathe with an eerie stillness. His ship had been hit by a rogue asteroid during a routine cargo run. Now he found himself stranded on an unknown world, far from any known trade routes. Grabbing his emergency pack, Jake slung it over his shoulder, his hand never straying far from the blaster holstered at his hip. The jungle whispered around him, filled with unfamiliar sounds that made his skin crawl. He had to find shelter fast. As he ventured deeper into the jungle, Jake's thoughts turned to survival. The ship was beyond repair, and his chances of getting off the planet were slim. But he had faced worse odds before. His sharp gaze swept the area for anything useful, every nerve on high alert. Then, the movement caught his eye. Just ahead, barely visible in the shadows, something moved. Jake's fingers tightened around the handle of his blaster as he cautiously approached. Hidden in the underbrush, a creature was caught in one of his hastily set perimeter traps. Its movements were fluid, predatory, but it was clearly struggling. Jake's heart pounded as he neared. The creature appeared humanoid, but with distinct differences. Her skin shimmered faintly under the filtered light, a mix of iridescent green scales that ran along her arms and shoulders. Golden eyes locked onto him, filled with a dangerous intelligence. A wild mane of silver-blue hair cascaded down her back, blending with the jungle's shadows. "Great." "An alien," Jake whispered under his breath. The alien female hissed, baring her sharp teeth. Her hands were bound by the netting from Jake's trap, but her posture was tense, every muscle ready to pounce. She was trapped, but not helpless. For a moment, they stared at each other, a silent battle of wills. She clearly expected him to finish her off, judging by the defiant look in her eyes. Jake raised his blaster, aiming straight at her, but hesitated. Something about her defiance, her fierce determination, made him pause. The alien's golden eyes flicked toward the blaster, then back to Jake. She didn't plead, didn't beg. She simply stared, waiting for what she assumed would be her end. Jake exhaled slowly and lowered the blaster. "I'm not going to kill you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Not unless you give me a reason to." The alien blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting this response. Her expression shifted, confusion overtaking the anger in her eyes. Jake knelt and began to undo the trap's bindings. "Look," he muttered, "I don't know what you are or why you're here, but we're both stuck on this rock. If you don't try to kill me, maybe we can figure out a way to survive." The moment the bindings loosened, she sprang back, her body tense and coiled like a snake ready to strike. But she didn't attack. Instead, she stared at Jake, her head tilted slightly as if she was trying to understand him. Jake stepped back, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm not your enemy," he said. "We can help each other." For a long moment, the alien studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, with a slow and deliberate movement, she straightened from her crouch. Though she kept her distance, the hostility in her eyes softened just slightly. "Name's Jake," he said, breaking the silence, though he wasn't sure if she could understand him. "If we're going to survive this, we should at least try not to kill each other." She didn't reply, but her eyes never left his. With a graceful motion, she turned and disappeared into the jungle, leaving Jake standing alone with more questions than answers. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. Well, that went better than expected. He had no idea who or what she was, but one thing was certain: surviving on this planet just got a whole lot more complicated. Jake watched as the alien woman disappeared into the thick undergrowth, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The jungle felt even more oppressive now that he knew he wasn't entirely alone on this planet. He wondered if there were more like her lurking in the shadows, watching his every move. "Well, that's not unsettling at all," he muttered, turning back toward the wreckage of his ship. He needed to focus on immediate survival, shelter, food, and water. The planet's humidity pressed down on him, and the distant roars of unseen creatures reminded him that danger was always near. He glanced at the emergency pack slung over his shoulder and began the trek back to the crash site, figuring he'd salvage what he could from the wreckage. When he arrived, the sight of his ruined ship filled him with a sinking feeling. Twisted metal and shattered parts littered the area, and a few small fires still smoldered. The cockpit was a lost cause, but he managed to scavenge some supplies: a multi-tool, emergency rations, and a handful of water purification tablets. After gathering everything, Jake built a small campfire near a rocky outcrop for warmth and a sense of security. As he sat on the edge of a fallen tree, his thoughts drifted back to the alien woman. Her golden eyes had been fierce, but not mindlessly aggressive. She had something else in her, something more than just survival instinct, a spark of intelligence. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustling in the trees. He reached for his blaster instinctively but relaxed when the alien woman stepped cautiously into view. She had returned, her movements graceful, and her eyes locked on him. Jake stood, keeping his blaster holstered but ready. "Didn't think I'd see you again so soon." She approached with deliberate caution, her posture no longer as tense as before. In her hands, she held something, a handful of strange, brightly colored fruits. Without a word, she tossed one toward him. He caught it awkwardly and examined the fruit, unsure if it was a peace offering or a test. The alien gestured to the fruit, mimicking the action of eating. Her eyes were fixed on him as if waiting for his response. Jake studied the fruit for a moment, then took a small bite. The taste was tangy and surprisingly refreshing. He smiled slightly and nodded. "Thanks," he said, holding up the fruit. Her golden eyes flickered, her expression unreadable as she sat on a nearby rock, watching him. Jake chewed thoughtfully and glanced back at the wreckage. There was a lot of work to do, and with no immediate way to communicate, this uneasy alliance seemed fragile at best. "We need to figure out how to get off this planet," Jake said, not really expecting a response, or at least how to survive long enough to be found. The alien woman tilted her head slightly, as if trying to decipher his words. After a moment, she pointed toward the wreckage and mimicked the action of something flying, her movements fluid and precise. She clearly understood the concept of escape. Jake's eyebrows shot up. "You want off this planet too, huh?" She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Okay," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe we can help each other after all." Over the next few hours, the two of them worked in relative silence. Jake focused on salvaging as much as he could from the wrecked ship while keeping an eye on the alien woman. She moved with practiced ease, scanning the jungle for threats and occasionally disappearing into the undergrowth, only to return with something useful: more fruits, medicinal plants, or vines she seemed to use for crafting simple tools. It became clear that she was not just a survivor but a skilled hunter and gatherer. Her knowledge of the jungle far exceeded his own, and though they couldn't communicate verbally, a quiet understanding was forming between them. As night fell, the sounds of the jungle grew louder, more menacing. Jake stoked the fire, its warm glow providing some comfort against the darkness. He glanced at the alien woman who sat across from him, her sharp eyes scanning the perimeter. She seemed at ease, but her alert posture suggested she was always ready for danger. Jake leaned back against a tree and sighed. "I don't even know your name," he said, half to himself. She turned her gaze toward him, her expression unreadable. After a long pause, she pointed to herself and spoke a single word in a soft, melodic tone. "Zara." Jake nodded, repeating her name. Zara. It felt strange on his tongue, but she acknowledged it with a small incline of her head. Well, Zara, I guess we're stuck together for now. He offered her a small smile, and to his surprise, she didn't recoil. Instead, she watched him with those keen golden eyes, perhaps trying to figure out this strange human who had spared her life. In the silence of the night, with only the crackling fire between them, the first fragile threads of trust began to form. The night passed slowly, the jungle alive with sounds that Jake couldn't identify. Zara, however, seemed completely attuned to the rhythm of the wilderness. She sat silently by the fire, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows, ever vigilant. Jake envied her calmness in the face of such unknown dangers. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Jake stretched his sore muscles and rubbed the stiffness from his neck. His thoughts turned back to their next steps. Survival would only get harder without a plan. "Guess we should get moving," Jake said, packing up his meager belongings. Zara stood as well, though she seemed far less concerned with material things. She carried only the vines and herbs she'd gathered, along with a few of the strange fruits she had shared the night before. As they set off deeper into the jungle, Jake couldn't help but notice how Zara moved with such ease, almost as if the terrain was second nature to her. In contrast, every step Jake took felt cumbersome, his boots sinking into the soft earth, vines catching at his legs. It was clear that Zara knew this land far better than he ever would. They traveled in silence for most of the morning, Zara leading the way. Occasionally, she would stop to examine a plant or listen intently to the sounds around them. Jake, for his part, kept his hand near his blaster, constantly on edge. Though he didn't fully trust Zara yet, he couldn't deny that she was his best chance at surviving. Around midday, they reached a wide river, its waters flowing swiftly through the jungle. Zara crouched at the bank, dipping her hand into the water and bringing it to her lips to taste. She then motioned for Jake to do the same. He knelt cautiously beside her and drank. The water was cool and refreshing, far cleaner than he expected. He looked at Zara, wiping his mouth. "Good find." She didn't respond, but she stood and began walking upstream, signaling him to follow. Jake fell in step beside her, his curiosity growing. There was clearly more to Zara than just a survivor. Her movements were too deliberate, her knowledge of the land too precise. As they continued along the riverbank, Jake's mind wandered back to the wreckage. Getting off this planet was still a priority, but without a functioning ship, that dream seemed distant. For now, his focus had to be on staying alive. And, in a strange way, that seemed a little easier with Zara at his side. They soon arrived at a large open clearing where the river forked into two smaller streams. Massive stone structures loomed ahead, half hidden by vines and foliage. Jake's breath caught in his throat. These weren't natural formations. They were ruins. Zara paused at the edge of the clearing, her golden eyes scanning the ancient structures with a mix of caution and reverence. Jake stepped forward, his gaze locked on the strange, alien architecture. The stones were etched with intricate patterns, symbols that didn't look like any language he had ever seen. "This place," Jake murmured, trailing off as he took in the sight. Zara moved ahead, her posture tense. She approached the ruins slowly, as if she were testing the air for danger. Jake followed, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and unease. What had they stumbled upon? As they ventured deeper into the ruins, the jungle seemed to fall silent, the only sound the faint trickle of water from the nearby streams. Zara moved with familiarity, as though she had been here before. Jake, however, was far more cautious, his eyes darting to every shadow. Suddenly, Zara stopped and held up a hand, signaling Jake to do the same. He froze, his pulse quickening as he scanned the area. He didn't see anything out of place, at first. Then he saw them. In the shadows of the ruins, half hidden by the overgrown vines, were more figures, humanoid like Zara, but larger and much more menacing. Their scales were darker, almost black, and their eyes gleamed with a cold, predatory light. Jake's hand instinctively went to his blaster. "Friends of yours?" he whispered, his voice tight with tension. Zara didn't respond. Her eyes were locked on the figures, her body tense. Slowly, she stepped forward, placing herself between Jake and the approaching group. The lead figure emerged from the shadows, towering over Zora. His scales shimmered darkly in the filtered light, and his golden eyes were filled with cold disdain. He spoke in a low, guttural language that Jake couldn't understand, but the hostility in his tone was unmistakable. Zora responded in the same tongue, her voice firm but calm. The exchange between them was rapid, filled with sharp gestures and quick glances toward Jake. Jake's grip tightened on his blaster. He didn't know what was being said, but he could feel the tension rising. The air was thick with unspoken threats. Finally, the lead figure let out a low growl, his eyes narrowing at Jake. He barked something at Zora, then turned and disappeared back into the shadows, followed by the others. Jake exhaled, his heart still racing. What the hell was that about? Zara turned to him, her expression unreadable. She pointed toward the ruins, then mimicked the action of a ship flying. Jake frowned, trying to piece together what she was saying. "You're saying there's a way off this planet here?" Zara nodded slowly, but her eyes remained wary. Whatever was inside these ruins, it wasn't going to be easy to access. Jake glanced at the ruins, then back at Zara. "All right," he said, drawing his blaster. "Let's find a way out of here." Together, they stepped into the shadowy depths of the ancient ruins, the unknown dangers ahead a stark reminder that survival was far from guaranteed. The interior of the ruins was vast, with high crumbling walls adorned with strange carvings that seemed to shift in the flickering light from Jake's torch. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water and the distant scurrying of unseen creatures. It was clear that this place hadn't been disturbed for a long time, perhaps even centuries. Zara moved cautiously, her eyes scanning the symbols etched into the stone, occasionally tracing a finger over one as though searching for something familiar. Jake followed closely, his blaster at the ready. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The encounter outside the ruins still gnawed at him. Who were those creatures? And why had they let them go? The deeper they ventured, the more the ruins began to reveal themselves. Strange, ancient technology lined the walls, most of it long dormant. Jake could see consoles, blinking dimly, their functions long forgotten. He paused at one, examining its strange layout. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, yet it felt oddly familiar, as if it were a distant cousin of the technology humans used. "This place is incredible," Jake whispered, awe creeping into his voice. "Who built this?" Zora didn't answer, her focus remaining on the path ahead. Her movements were purposeful, like she knew exactly where they were going. Jake couldn't help but wonder if Zara had been here before, or if her people had some connection to the ruins. They soon entered a massive central chamber, its ceiling towering high above them, disappearing into darkness. In the center of the room, surrounded by vines and dust, was an enormous structure. It looked like a ship, or at least some kind of vessel. Its sleek design was partially obscured by centuries of neglect, but it still exuded a sense of power. Zora approached the vessel, her steps slow and reverent. She touched the hull gently, and for a brief moment, Jake thought he saw a flicker of emotion cross her face, something like relief, or perhaps hope. She then turned to Jake and pointed at the vessel, gesturing to the sky. "You think this thing can still fly?" Jake asked, skeptical. Zara nodded, her eyes filled with determination. She moved toward a nearby console, her fingers gliding over the alien symbols with practiced ease. Lights flickered to life, illuminating the chamber in a soft glow. The hum of ancient machinery filled the air as the vessel began to power up. Jake stood back, watching in amazement. Zara was clearly more than just a survivor. She was tied to this place in ways he hadn't fully grasped. The vessel, the ruins, the strange technology, it was all connected to her. Before he could ask any more questions, the ground beneath them rumbled. Dust and small rocks tumbled from the ceiling as the ancient structure groaned under the strain of centuries. Zara froze, her eyes darting to the entrance they had come through. "They're coming, aren't they?" Jake muttered, gripping his blaster tighter. Zara nodded sharply, her expression grim. She hurried to the vessel, her hands working quickly to activate its systems. The low hum intensified as the ship began to stir from its long slumber, lights flashing and panels coming to life. Jake moved to the entrance, his eyes scanning the darkness. He couldn't see anything yet, but he could feel the danger closing in. The figures they had encountered earlier weren't going to let them escape without a fight. He glanced back at Zara, who was working feverishly to get the ship operational. "How long until this thing is ready?" Jake asked, his voice tense. Zara responded with a brief gesture, fingers close together, indicating they didn't have much time. Jake cursed under his breath. Of course. No rush or anything. Just as he turned back to the entrance, a shadow moved in the darkness. His pulse quickened, and he raised his blaster, aiming toward the movement. The figures from earlier were closing in, their dark scales blending into the shadows, making them difficult to spot. But Jake could sense them, predators stalking their prey. A low growl echoed through the chamber, and one of the creatures stepped into the dim light. It was larger than the others, its eyes glowing with malice as it locked onto Jake. Behind it, more figures emerged, their movements fluid and deadly. Jake fired, the blaster's shots lighting up the chamber in brief flashes. The creatures moved with unnerving speed, dodging the bolts and spreading out, trying to surround him. He cursed again and fired off a few more shots, forcing them to keep their distance. "Zara, any time now," Jake shouted, backing toward the vessel. Zara was focused, her fingers flying over the controls. The ship was slowly rising off the ground, its engines roaring to life. But it wasn't fast enough. One of the creatures lunged at Jake, its claws extended. He fired, hitting it square in the chest. The creature let out a screech and collapsed, but more were closing in. Just as Jake was about to fire again, Zara called out. The vessel's door had opened, and she was motioning for him to get inside. Without hesitation, Jake sprinted toward the ship, diving inside just as the creatures surged forward. Zara slammed the door shut, and the vessel lifted off the ground, shaking violently as it ascended. The creatures outside pounded on the hull, their screeches echoing through the chamber. But the ship was rising faster now, breaking free from the ruins and shooting up into the sky. Jake collapsed into one of the seats, breathing heavily as the adrenaline surged through his veins. "That was close," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Zora glanced at him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and relief. She had done it. They had escaped the ruins, and now they had a way off the planet. But as Jake looked out the window at the dense jungle below, he knew this was only the beginning. There were still too many questions. Who were those creatures? What was this place? And most importantly, where would this ship take them now? Zara sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the stars ahead. Jake couldn't tell if she was planning their next move or simply savoring the moment of freedom. Either way, their fates were now tied together in ways neither of them could have anticipated. "Looks like we're not done yet," Jake said quietly. Zara nodded, her golden eyes gleaming in the dim light. The ship soared into the atmosphere, the dense jungle quickly fading away beneath them, replaced by a blanket of stars. The vessel hummed with ancient power, its system slowly stabilizing as Zara expertly guided it through the void. Jake remained seated, catching his breath, the weight of the day's events finally sinking in. Zara had saved their lives, and this ship, this relic from a forgotten age, was their ticket off the hostile planet. But the questions swirling in Jake's mind refused to settle. The ruins, the creatures, the ancient technology. It all pointed to something far bigger than just a routine cargo run gone wrong. As the ship cruised through space, Zora activated a few more controls, and a holographic map flickered to life in front of them. The map was vast, showing star systems Jake didn't recognize. He watched as Zora studied it, her expression focused. Clearly, she had a destination in mind, but Jake wasn't about to let her steer the ship without some answers. "All right, Zora," Jake said, breaking the silence. "I think it's time you told me what's really going on. Who were those creatures back there? And what's so important about this ship?" Zora didn't look at him immediately, her golden eyes still fixed on the map. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she touched the side of the control panel. A different hologram appeared. This time, a series of symbols and images Jake had never seen before. One of them resembled the ship they were currently flying. Another showed the creatures they had fought. And at the center of it all was a symbol, one that glowed with an eerie blue light, pulsating like a heartbeat. Jake frowned, trying to make sense of it. "What is that?" Zora finally turned to him, her expression serious. She pointed at the glowing symbol, then at herself. You're connected to this somehow, aren't you?" Jake asked, piecing it together. "This ship, those ruins, they were built by your people." Zora nodded, her gaze softening as she placed a hand over her heart. It was a gesture Jake didn't fully understand, but he got the sense it held deep meaning for her. She pointed again to the symbol, then to the stars ahead. Jake leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. "You're trying to find them. Your people. That's what all this is about." Zora's expression grew more solemn as she pointed to the hologram showing the hostile creatures. Then she drew her finger across her throat, a universal gesture Jake had no trouble interpreting. "They were wiped out," Jake muttered, "by those creatures." She nodded again, her jaw tight with a mixture of anger and sorrow. Jake felt a surge of sympathy. He had lost people before, friends, comrades, but the weight of what Zora had endured seemed far heavier. Her entire species, her culture, erased by a merciless enemy. And now she was alone, searching for any trace of what had once been. "So, you think there are survivors?" Jake asked gently. "Others like you out there?" Zora hesitated, then shrugged. It was clear she wasn't sure, but the hope in her eyes was unmistakable. Jake nodded, processing everything. "I get it now. That's why you were on that planet. You were looking for clues, for anything that could lead you to others." Zora gave him a faint smile, the first real sign of warmth he had seen from her since they'd met. It was brief, but it was enough to let Jake know that she trusted him, at least a little. The ship continued its steady course, the stars around them shifting as they moved through the galaxy. Jake watched the holographic map, noting the star systems Zora had plotted out. It was a long journey ahead, and there were no guarantees that they would find what she was looking for. Still, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose. He had crash-landed on that jungle planet thinking he was on his own, but now he was part of something bigger. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about discovery, about helping Zora find the answers she had been searching for. The silence stretched between them for a few moments before Jake finally broke it again. "Listen," he said, leaning forward. "I don't know where this journey is going to take us, but I'm in. Whatever it is you're searching for, I'll help you find it. You saved my life back there. And, well, I think I owe you." Zora looked at him, her golden eyes filled with gratitude. She gave him a small nod, acknowledging his offer. With that, the mood in the ship seemed to shift. They were no longer just two survivors, thrown together by circumstance. They were partners now, united by a shared goal. Jake leaned back in his seat, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Well, Zora, looks like we got a long road ahead of us. Let's see what the galaxy has in store." Zora turned her attention back to the controls, plotting their next course. As the ship sped deeper into the vastness of space, Jake couldn't help but feel a spark of excitement. They had escaped the ruins, survived the dangers of the planet, and now they were heading into the unknown, together. The stars stretched out before them, an endless expanse of possibilities. Whatever came next, Jake knew they were ready to face it. And so their journey continued, bound not only by survival, but by the hope of discovering something greater, a truth hidden in the stars, waiting to be uncovered. The galaxy was vast, and its mysteries many, but Jake and Zara were determined to find the answers, no matter where the path led. And for the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The end.